everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar with CJBS on corporate governance and internal controls and compliance. Thank you for joining us. I am Laurie Parfitt. I am with LKP Impact Consulting, and I am your host today. And with me is Ryan Guedel, who's a partner at CJBS. Hi, Ryan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Laurie.
Thank you for joining us. We have a really great topic here. So we are just getting out of tax season. Everybody has kind of closed their books, and thinking about accounting is probably not very top of mind. However, right now is really the time where we want to focus on internal controls and compliance and corporate governance and getting all of that structure together to ensure that as we get back into tax season for next year, everything is set up properly. So we will be talking about three big topics today, but before we do, I will have Ryan introduce himself. Ryan?
Thank you, Laurie. So I'm Ryan Guedel. I'm a partner at CJBS in Northbrook, and we're a CPA firm that obviously specializes in the cannabis industry. I've been here with the firm for about 13 years, and currently we're about 70 people. So nice mid-sized firm with some good horsepower to be able to help individuals and investors in the cannabis industry.
Thank you for that amazing intro, Ryan. And we are excited to have you here on this webinar. And as I said, we are going to be covering three topics today. And so we'll start out with our first one, which is internal controls. And so, as we know, internal controls are really critical to the success of any organization, but are incredibly impactful for the cannabis space as this is highly regulated. There's a lot of landmines that you can run into as you are sitting in such a nascent industry. And we know that in the cannabis space, it's really very much about mitigating your risk. There's a lot of gray area. So, with that, Ryan, can you explain to our audience what are internal controls and why do you need them?
So internal controls are basically auditing or accounting processes or procedures that are put in place to basically ensure that financial reporting and compliance are there and essentially perfect. So you want to make sure that those are in place, right, so that you have good financial numbers, whether that's for the state, for the IRS, or for your potential investors.
I think that's a very important thing to have and something that needs to be set up and structured quite well. So, with internal controls, that sort of started out, in the sort of the Sarbanes-Oxley days, and now we're seeing it kind of proliferate across, accounting for all industries. But as I said, really very important for the cannabis space. And so when we think about the cannabis industry and with it being very nascent, very gray area, can you talk about some of the internal control deficiencies that you've seen either in the cannabis space or in other industries that you think would be helpful for our audience to understand?
Well, the first deficiency we see a lot of is on the inventory side. And you would think, well, how is that possible when, everything is essentially inventoried within the cannabis space? Again, garbage in, garbage out to any of the systems that our clients are potentially working on. So with that being said, we need to have some good solid internal controls around the inventory process. And so one of the things that we would always recommend in that case is essentially having physical inventories. Okay. And now is that if you're getting an audit, you have to have a year-end physical inventory, which we do for our clients that have audits. But if I'm working with a client that's just getting started, I probably want those physical inventory audits done on a quarterly basis. And then on the high ticket items, either high turnover or high dollar amounts, I probably want to do cycle counts within a month to take a look at those items. So a couple controls that we can put in place there. The other thing as well that we see, and this isn't just cannabis company related, it's all company related, it's time stealing. And one of the things that employees end up doing is, their time cards, they walked in at 8:05 and suddenly now they were there at 8 o'clock. And you end up, those 5 minutes, adding those up over a year turn into a whole lot of time. So one of the things that we've also recommended to clients is have biometric time clocks, where again, it needs to be a fingerprint. It's not a code or anything. It's either your eye scan or a fingerprint scan, that then you have a time clock that is linked to payroll and everything. One, it helps take one of those processes off the client's plate, but then it adds the other side. The internal control is perfect, because we know that if it says that that person was there at 8 o'clock, they absolutely were there at 8 o'clock in the morning.
That's a really interesting perspective. I hadn't really ever thought about, 5 minutes here or there really meaning anything, but that's an interesting control that companies really need to consider to put into place. In the cannabis space, we do a lot of that biometric as well, because there are so many, locked doors. There are so many protocols that you need to comply with. But I think that is something that a lot of people don't think about, is that 5 minutes here or there is not usually is more negligible, but over time it can cause a big issue.
And it's those little pinpricks. Again, as you know, you're not, as a business owner or management, you may not even see that, or you just think, oh, it's 5 minutes, it's not a big deal. But when you basically extrapolate that over, an entire year, 365 days, 5 minutes every day, that turns into a whole lot of time that could have been then used as efficiency. Is that person doing the physical inventory audit and kind of working on that? Well, how much efficiency did we end up losing because of that? So internal controls are not only just making sure that everything's kind of buttoned down for your financial reporting, it's also making sure that everything's running efficiently. Are there any items of quicksand, is like I like to call it, where if you're following the flow of information and how things are going through the process, is there something where it just things get stuck, or it's just not as efficient? It's not a nice flow. Well, that's something that we need to do and we need to address, because if we're losing efficiency, you're losing dollars. And if we're losing dollars, obviously that's not what we're trying to do. You're not going to get an ROI on that. We need to make a change.
Right. And no cannabis operator can afford to lose dollars. We are living in a world right now of limited investment into the space. Equity investment is down over 90%, debt investment is down over 40%. So every single dollar in the cannabis space counts. And so making sure that you have everything lined up so you're not losing a little bit here or there, because you're right. I mean, we think back to, the old days, it was, office space where they were like shaving off a couple pennies or percentages of pennies.
Yep.
And all of a sudden that ended up being, millions of dollars. That can happen in the cannabis space as well. And that is a huge impact to a small to mid-sized business.
Yep.
So let's talk about inventory for a second, because this is an area that a lot of cannabis operators really struggle with. So, doing inventory is never fun. And especially like if you're in a dispensary, or even if you're in a manufacturing facility, doing those regular cycle counts, that can be expensive. Have you seen any operators do anything like RFID technology or any other type of, technology-led initiatives that have really helped aid operators in their inventory process?
The RFID is what we are seeing. And again, for the reason being that, you can put the scanners above, so when the inventory comes in, as soon as the RFID gets that radio wave, it knows that we have that inventory in stock. That's definitely streamlining some things, but again, it's like anything. Garbage in, garbage out. The whole thing with the RFID chips is it's supposed to not, as long as it passes through, it should recognize. One of the things that we've seen is there's been a couple issues with some clients. And again, this isn't on the cannabis industry, it's more on the distribution side, but where some of the RFID transmittals weren't coming through. So let's say if 200 items got pushed out, 198 items were getting registered. And so we've had a little bit of some issues with that and getting that ironed out. And obviously, before I would want to move that into any of my cannabis clients, I want to make sure that stuff's ironed out, because again, they really, as you said, they have no dollars to basically be the beta testers for any of this. That can't occur. We're already in a situation where we need to conserve funds as an industry as much as possible.
Couldn't agree with you more. So, as an accounting professional for the cannabis space, when you think about these internal controls, how do you start out with a client? How do you really identify where some of these gaps are? What is your process for that?
Well, it depends on if it's a client that's in a startup stage or if they're a little bit more mature. If they're a little bit more mature, what we end up doing is basically creating an RCM, which is a risk control matrix, and then basically kind of drawing out what their current process is. I have to understand what the current process is before I can make recommendations on what we need to change. And ultimately, what we kind of do is we create the current RCM, we create what a perfect world would be, and then we kind of build something that is somewhere in the middle. Because again, remember, cannabis companies, just like many companies, you got one or two people doing, four people's or five people's duties. So how do we structure that and create segregation of duties where if that person is doing too many items, there is some sort of management oversight where somebody else is doing a check the box and making sure that we're not running into any issues. So if they're a mature entity, that's how we kind of structure it. If they're really getting and in the startup phase, I basically are kind of going to help them design the control philosophy around that from the start. Because one of the things, it's much harder once a company's a little bit more mature to kind of grab their process and wrangle it and change it, because some people are set in their ways. They don't
Old
like
habits
change.
die hard.
Absolutely, absolutely. Whereas it's probably easier to kind of start fresh and kind of build that correctly. The other side of that kind of then leads into our second topic with corporate governance. Because again, if we're setting up a sound internal control structure, there's usually sound corporate governance. They kind of go hand in hand. If there's, and I'm sure you probably have seen this before from any companies you've worked with, Laurie, if they don't really have good internal controls, their corporate governance is probably wishy-washy as well. They kind of, it really goes hand in hand, and how all of that works. It's really, how the corporation feels and how they police themselves, essentially.
I think that makes complete sense. And you just segued us into our next topic, which is corporate governance. And so we know that corporate governance is the system of rules, practices, and processes by which a company is directed. It really sets the framework for the organization, and it protects the interest of all the stakeholders. So in cannabis, regulatory scrutiny is incredibly high. This is not a federally legal industry. And so the compliance associated with it is exponentially more than you see in other industries that are not as highly regulated. And, corporate governance is really critical for ensuring compliance. And so when it comes to corporate governance, how does it relate to the cannabis accounting side?
So the way that it relates to the cannabis accounting side is that at least the way that I think about it, is more of an NPO type situation. And what do I mean by that? A lot of times, not-for-profit clients have monthly or quarterly board meetings where there's essentially a complete oversight of what is going on. And ultimately, that is what my recommendation is for our cannabis clients, is to, when they get going, is to have that type of corporate oversight and governance oversight. So what does that mean? Okay. A lot of times, as we just talked about, you're going to have maybe 3-5 people that are doing a whole lot of things, during the month, and kind of running around like chickens with their heads cut off. But again, that's what they have to do. It is what it is. When the financials get done, okay, remember, they're so far down in the weeds, we need to have a higher level view. So now when the financials are done, is there a meeting where president, CEO, CFO, outside accountant, and potentially some of the investors are meeting on a quarterly, or monthly basis, depending on when it's needed, to kind of look over everything and how are we doing? How's everything going? And then that's another side of that, is following with internal controls. So with a lot of our NPO clients, what they do is they have thresholds for like check writing. Okay, so every check that's over $5,000 needs 2 signatures. Well, guess when every check that's under $5,000 gets looked at these board meetings. Everybody basically gets a copy of all the other checks that are under the materiality threshold that they can look through. So if somebody sees that there is 8 $600 payments to one vendor, they're probably going to start asking some questions on why did we have 8, or 6 $800 payments to this vendor. And some of that oversight will come out, because again, if I'm so far down in the weeds, I may not even realize that, because I am just trying to get everything and keep everything running.
Right.
Because of that, you still need to have somebody who isn't running around like a chicken with their head cut off, who can slow down and look at it and provide that oversight for the entity. And so when I think of corporate governance, at least in the cannabis industry, I really want to structure our clients to be more on the NPO side. And that NPO model really follows more of a publicly traded company model, with the board members and things like that. Ultimately, that's where our cannabis clients want to go. So I think ultimately, if we set them up that way at the start, it's easier as they grow, instead of, like I said, trying to halfway during the process grab it and say, oh, let's insert these corporate meetings, and oversight, when maybe that's not what was happening before. And it's kind of hard to wrangle things in, like you said, when old habits have already been established.
Right. And, changing processes midstream is always difficult. I mean, even if you look at the technology side, implementing a new system, people are always like, oh, hey, no, I don't want to mess with that.
Yep.
And I would think that internal controls, corporate governance, it's really the same thing. And I like your perspective on kind of taking that conservative approach. So taking that non-for-profit approach, taking that publicly traded company approach. When we talk about the cannabis space and we talk about the laws and regulations that kind of govern it, we always say, like, you can be stricter than the law, you just can't be more lax than the law. And so I think taking that conservative approach will really set cannabis companies up for success, because there's a lot of them that aren't really thinking about this. They have a great idea, they get their business up and running, they apply for their licenses, they get their facilities, and these become afterthoughts. And so really finding the right balance of structuring your company and making sure that it's set up to scale for the future, I think is really important. So do you have any examples of other best practices that you've seen in the cannabis space that operators can utilize?
At least from the governance side, I would definitely say that I want to have those board meetings. Those are definite. And whether that,
Okay.
it depends on the company and how it's structured, how many investors you have and things like that, and the type of investors. But ultimately, I want some of the higher dollar amount or percentage amount investors that are there. Because one of the things that we're seeing as well, and one of my concerns is within the industry, at least from the investment side, what happens if there is a fraud situation? And there was one just recently, which, what was the name of that company? American Patriot Brands. So they had a $30 million fraud with 100 different investors. But again, how could that potentially have been stopped? Well, if those investors were having a board meeting on a monthly or quarterly basis, I think some of the questions could have got asked and potentially answered. One of the things that was found in the fraud is that they were saying that they had Colorado operations and they did not. How does that happen?
How does it happen?
Good question. But here's the thing, right? If you're having these types of board meetings, right, I'm sure that there would be an investor who would have asked that question or said, hey, can somebody tell me a rundown of all the states that we're operating in? And then when there was crickets back, the investor might have asked some questions and said, uh-oh, this might not be the place for my money. But, right, so if you're thinking about how did that blow up and what would I do and, to try to make sure that doesn't happen to my clients, again, these board meetings and that management oversight is paramount. When I think about the industry, right, everybody thinks about the black market, and things being done under the table. I want to change the entire paradigm of the industry to where we're acting like quality businesses and acting like we're publicly traded companies. Why? Because when we get there, we want to act like we've already been there, right? That's the ultimate goal. So how do we change that? If, the companies that I work with, we kind of put the structure in place, they're not going to be, they're not going to end up like this entity. Or what was the other entity, Juicy Fields, which was the European one that blew up last year, which was the crowdfunding platform and stuff as well for growers. I mean, so there's a lot of there's potential scams that are going to be coming out within the industry as we're getting, more dollars, more prevalence comes to the industry. How are we going to protect individuals and companies? Like I said, I think it's having those type of board meetings is really kind of, the baseline. If you have that and the investors have a direct way of communication with, the corporate office, I think that's perfect. For instance, I'm invested in Uncle Arnie's. I got an email from the CEO with the investor relations in the packet from Theo and everything. I can email directly back to him. Perfect. That's exactly what I'm looking for is transparency. And that's the type of transparency we want for our clients.
I think that's fabulous. And so what I really hear from you is it's really about professionalizing this industry. We've got to stop acting like we're sitting in the shadows, like we are part of the legacy market. We have to treat these companies as real companies because they are real companies that have an impact on our economy. They have an impact on their investors. They have an impact on consumers. And so from every perspective, we need to really make sure that we're professionalizing, we're providing those outlets for transparency, we're structuring companies the way they should be done, not just throwing things together. It's really about taking this industry out of the shadows and into the light. And the only way we're going to do that is if we operate like other companies in other industries.
Correct. And basically show everybody, hey, we're having board meetings. We're trying to be as transparent as possible. If something goes wrong, but it's not because of any other reason other than something went wrong. Things can go wrong. The thing that concerns me is if there was a fraud at a distribution company and it was on the news, they'd be saying that person is terrible and they'd be, wagging their finger at the person. If that happened at a cannabis dispensary, it wouldn't be about the person. It would be bad cannabis dispensary. And that's the whole connotation I want to shift.
So I think that is one of the most important points is that the cannabis industry is viewed very differently because we are not federally legal. We are coming out of prohibition. We are coming out of the shadows. And the one thing that someone told me when I first joined the industry, and I quote this a lot, is what we do now will affect the industry 5, 10, 100 years from now. So don't screw it up.
Exactly. I do not want to be the person that was the accountant for the cannabis entity that had the huge fraud that stopped, everything in its tracks and put us 3 to 5 years behind because everyone's saying, see, I told you so. I don't want to be that guy. And I don't want anybody in the industry to be that guy. But I think, again, with the Silicon Valley Bank and your FTX things, the chances of this potentially happening are higher and more likely than not to occur. So how do we do anything about it? We have this type of webinar and kind of sounding the alarm, waving the white flag saying, hey, if individuals or entities need help on this, we're here, we can assist.
I think that's fantastic. And I think the message here is don't be that guy. Don't be the one who screws it up for the rest of us.
Yes.
So we all have to be above board. Our industry has to be more above board than anyone else because we are trying to get to that place where we're accepted as another community.
Yep.
And so doing things the right way is going to help all of us be better going forward. Yep. So thinking about our last topic, which is going to be compliance. And whenever I think about this industry, I think about compliance. And when I joined the cannabis space back in 2019, I had a compliance leader and she was phenomenal. And she would always talk about compliance. And I'm like, really? Like, is that really the number one thing that we need to be focusing on? And after 4 years in this space, I would say yes, compliance is paramount. And I think compliance with marketing, which is what I do, with accounting, which is what you do, all of it, compliance kind of brings it all together. And we
Yep.
need to make sure that we are always being compliant. And the regulatory landscape really can change daily.
Yep.
And so we need to stay on top of that. And you as an accounting professional can help organizations navigate some of those challenges. So what do you see as some of the key compliance challenges facing the cannabis space, and how can they be addressed?
So this might be a little bit different than what you were expecting, but one of the things that I'm concerned about is data security. So, right,
Huh.
and I see your reaction. I know that's probably different than what you were expecting me to say, but my concern, at least right now, is for like our dispensary clients, right? They have information of who their clientele is. As we are trying to legitimize this industry, one of the things that concerns me is, what if somebody is the mayor of a town and goes into a dispensary? He might not want everybody to know that that's what he's doing. Well, what happens if there's a data leak from one of our dispensaries? That, again, all of our compliance and everything else, that everything falls to the wayside if that occurs and somebody hacks a dispensary or hacks basically, uh, users' records. What happens in that situation? Again, it's not looked at in the same regard as if that happened and it was Target, right? Target, when it happened to Target and Home Depot, oh, they're going to give you monitoring and everything will be
Oh,
fine and all of that, but Target and Home Depot just kept moving along, right? It happened, it occurred, it stinks, they fixed it. What happens if that's a cannabis dispensary? They're not going to just be able to fix it. They're going to go poof. They're going to be gone the next day. And that's one of my concerns, at least from the industry, making sure that our clients and anybody in this industry has good data security and cybersecurity around, because, ultimately what happens, I haven't heard of one of those breaches at this point, but what happens when one of those does happen?
well, it can be a huge issue. So, we have a lot of adult use states here, but we also have a lot of medical states, and we have a lot of medical dispensaries. So
Yep.
there's HIPAA compliance associated with that.
Yeah,
Those
and
are
then HIPAA compliance. Yep, didn't even think about that side. Yes. Oh yeah.
right. So there's people's medical information. And as I sat when I ran dispensaries, I would sit in the waiting rooms, and I would listen to people come in. And a lot of times they didn't want to give the front desk person their email, their phone number, their information,
Yep.
because they didn't want people to know that they were there. They didn't want their
Hmm.
spouse to know. They didn't want their friends to know.
Yep.
And when we see a data leak like that, which I'm glad you brought it up, because I think it's something that is not widely thought about, is that it's not just your financial information, it's not just people's credit card information. This is also their personal medical information,
Yep.
and
Oh yeah.
you don't want that getting out. That is a financial compliance issue, that is a HIPAA compliance issue, and that will make the news incredibly quick.
Of course. And it won't be, oh, bad data security breach. It's going to be bad cannabis company. And that's, again, where the connotation and everything, we just have to change that paradigm. It's not those things that can happen to a cannabis company can happen to pretty much any other entity. It should be looked in the same light, but we know that it's not at this moment.
It's always amplified in the cannabis space. So when we think about data security, what do you suggest to your clients that they do? What do you suggest that they set up?
So basically have an IT audit. So again, like I would come in and basically, essentially kind of do an internal control analysis, same kind of thing. We'd either want our IT staff or somebody else, another firm that we're comfortable with, looking at that and making sure that things are buttoned down, that there's a firewall, two-factor authentication. A lot of those things have been put in place. And yes, it may cost a little bit, but as you know, the cost for non-compliance is multiple times that actually just putting in and dealing with it in the first place. So ultimately, it'll save these companies dollars. And that's what we're trying to do, right? And with all of this, we're trying to make sure they're secured. So when they grow in the right way, and there's no gremlins under the carpet, no potential issues that we haven't addressed, and that when they start to make money and grow, they can just focus on making money and growing instead of thinking, oh no, we're not compliant. Oh no, data security. Oh no, BioTrack isn't picking up what we need to from our inventory software, and all of that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that. It really needs to be about setting it up at the very beginning, making sure you structure it properly. So as you scale, you can focus on scaling your business and you don't have to worry about all of that structure and process and having to recreate that.
Yep.
So we are getting to the end of our time here, Ryan, and this has been a fantastic discussion. If any of our listeners want to reach out to you, how would they do so?
So best way to get in contact with me is shoot me an email. So my email is rjg@cjbs.com. Or you can give me a call, 847-580-5432 is my direct line at the office. And if anybody's got any questions around cannabis, internal controls, compliance, corporate governance, I'd love to assist and provide some feedback.
I love that, Ryan. Thank you so much for your time today. And I think this is the side of the industry we don't talk enough about. And so I am thrilled that you are able to give our listeners such a great rundown of all of the things that they need to be thinking about. And thank you to all of you for listening. I'm Laurie Parfitt. I'm with LKP Impact Consulting, and thank you so much for your time today.